And welcome back to Subculture on CentralCoastRadio.com. Well, I read a lot of books, and there are very few books in the past that have affected me the way that IRINA'S Gift affected me. It is a brand new book from Karen Kirsten, and it is such a personal tale, and there is so much in this book that I am sure is going to make a lot of you very, very emotional out there when you read it. But we thought we would actually get Karen on the phone today to chat a little bit about this magnificent brand new book. So welcome to the program, Karen.
Thank you, David. Thank you for that beautiful introduction.
Oh, no worries. Karen, this book is just absolutely amazing. I read it and then I read it again. That was the effect that it had on me. I was wondering if you could tell our listeners a little bit about what they can expect to read in IRINA'S Gift.
Well, it's all started with this whopping secret in my family. When I was 9 and at school one day, my mum received this letter from a stranger who told her that during World War II, she had been born inside this area that later became known as the Warsaw Ghetto, where the Nazis walled in around 400,000 Jewish people. That was 30% of Warsaw's population. And then the letter said that when the Nazis started rounding up my mum's relatives for trains to the Treblinka extermination camp, Mum was given enough sleeping drug that she might not ever wake up, tucked into a backpack, and smuggled out with her parents. And then the letter said that later, when Mum was 11 months old, that her mother, Irina, was murdered. And if that wasn't enough to make my mum faint on the floor, a year after that, an SS officer rescued her. And even though all of this had been kept secret from Mum, she then kept it secret from me. And when I was a teenager, I found out that the grandparents I adored weren't my biological grandparents. So IRINA'S Gift is really about the lies we all tell to survive our pasts, and then what happens when those lies unravel.
I know it sounds like a stereotype, but when something like that happens in your family and you find out a secret like that, it changes everything. I've been through it in my own family where I found out that my own heritage wasn't the heritage that I believed it was when a secret came out. So what was that like for you? You mentioned about what it was like for your mother, but what was it like for you when you found out that about your mother and also your grandparents?
Well, I think, when I found out I was 13, so I think processing it as a child is a little different from processing something like that when you find out if you're an adult. Yep. At the time, I just remember the physical reaction. My mum was very talkative, and she shut up when we found out. She had promised the woman I knew as my grandmother, I'll call her my Melbourne grandmother, she was an Auschwitz survivor, and she had promised when the letter arrived that she would never tell us unless we asked. And she said, I won't lie to them. And we came home from school one day on Remembrance Day, November 11th, and asked some questions about the war. And my sister naively said, where were you during the war, Mum? And that's when we found out. I just remember the physical reaction. I was laughing, crying, and hiccuping all at the same time. We had actually, after the letter arrived, we had actually flown to Canada to meet my mum's biological grandfather, and we were told to call him Uncle Dick.
Yep.
And I've heard other people say in situations like this that uncle thing is quite common. And so when we found out, we asked, well, who's your father? And Mum said Uncle Dick. And so we were crying and screaming, and it was just what I realise now, total shock.
Definitely. So tell us a little bit about your journey from there, because of course you went off and became a marketing executive, but when did you decide that this was the time to write this amazing book?
I think it was a bit of a lifetime journey because it all started with a promise I made my Melbourne grandmother after Schindler's List came out. So I really have Tom Keneally to thank, who amazingly read and endorsed Irina's Gift. When the movie came out, my grandmother asked me to take her, and a week or so after dinner in a restaurant, she started telling me about Auschwitz. Nobody in our family had talked about the war. My grandparents did not talk about the war. And she started telling me about Dr. Mengele and how he lined her up on the assembly platz in Auschwitz and inspected her with his white gloves. And then later, after I moved to the US, and for the first time, I was surrounded by Jewish people because most of the people I met in my grandparents' living room I thought of as Polish. I knew they were Jewish. My grandparents were atheist, and most of the people I met at my grandparents were certainly not practicing Jews. And so I asked my grandmother if I could interview her, and I flew home and I interviewed her over a week, and on the last day she told me her story, and on the last day she said to me, "I'm worried this is going to happen again. What happened to me is going to happen again. Do you think someone would want to know all this?" And that's when I promised her I would write her story.
That's absolutely amazing. And I have to ask as well, you went and did a lot of research when you were working on this novel. What was that like for you? Of course, doing research, and I know it's something that I'm experiencing now as well, going back and doing research into what happened during that time. Does that change how you view things within your own family as well?
Absolutely. I think one thing that was really important to me, but people heard this story and they asked me, "Is this a true story?" And I'd say yes. It was really important to me to write this as narrative nonfiction. So it is heavily researched, but I wanted it to read like a novel so that people could really engage with this this 3-generational mother-daughter story. But, one thing I learned, Dave, was the research for me was learning how to listen and be curious about gaps in my grandmother's story.
Yep.
Because excuse me, I'm just going to take a sip of water. For people who have experienced horrible traumas, often the truth is in what they don't tell you. And so I had to turn into a detective. For example, I'll give you an example. My grandmother told me once when I was at her place, I'd lost a button on my cardigan and I asked for a needle and thread, and she told me she'd never sewn in her life. Why would I have anything like that in her house? And back to that dinner when she first told me about Auschwitz, at the end, I naively asked her, "What was the worst thing that happened to you?" And she told me that she had traded her pieces of bread in Auschwitz for some small pieces of fabric from women who marched back from the factories, and she sewed together a nightdress. Remember, she told me she couldn't sew.
Yeah.
And at nighttime, because there were no showers or baths or anything like that, at nighttime she would take off her foul-smelling uniform and she would put this nightdress on. And for somebody who was deemed subhuman, this gave her a feeling of normalcy. So she had built up, as do people who've suffered trauma, these walls of silence to hold in these experiences that were so horrible she couldn't understand them herself. So the lesson here, I guess, in research is to be really curious. You have to think behind the headline and look deeper. She left me some clues and I had to follow them.
Definitely. And how did you find the experience of actually writing IRINA'S Gift? Did you find it was kind of difficult, or did you find it very therapeutic actually being able to sit down and write and get it all down on paper?
That's a really good question. I don't think it was therapeutic. It became as the world started to change and we saw the rise of authoritarian leaders around the world, it became a burden of responsibility for me. So initially I started out, it was a little bit exciting. I was looking for an SS officer who had saved my mother, and the more I studied the extremes of human behaviour, I was inspired by the heroes who risked their lives to save my mum. And despite all the hatred that was swirling around them, but the more I studied these extremes of human behaviour, I found myself, and as the world changed and then the pandemic hit, I found myself sort of sliding into a little bit of numbness. There's this theme in the book of this notion of a wall that people put up to protect themselves, and I realised I had a bit of a wall myself. But on the writing, I wasn't a writer. I had to learn how to write, and I'm fortunate enough to live in Boston, where I have amazing access to fabulous classes at Harvard and other places like that. And I read a lot and had to learn how to write. I read a lot of fiction too, because I think writing non-fiction, who wants to hear about somebody's family? You really have to learn how to tell a good story. So anybody out there who's thinking of doing that for their family, I would recommend reading a lot of books.
Definitely. Well, Karen, I know we are running out of time very, very quickly, but before we go, I'd love to ask, what would you like to say to people who are about to sit down and read IRINA'S Gift?
Well, I want people to be inspired by the heroes, how they were not indifferent, that they fought for democracy. Please fight for democracy and civility, because I wouldn't be here if a few people hadn't have shown empathy and kindness towards my mum. You know, the educational organisation I work with, I'm a genocide educator, their motto is the perfect motto for this book. It's people make choices and choices make history.
That is very true. Very, very true. Thank you so much for chatting to us today, Karen. It's been an absolute honour having you on the show. And for all of our listeners out there, IRINA'S Gift is out now. You can get it in trade paperback, audio, and ebook. So, Karen, thank you so much for taking the time to chat to us today. It's been an absolute honour having you on the show.
It was an honour being here. Thanks, Dave.